Hello everyone, this is AndresRestart, and today we are talking about things that Nintendo won't and can't get wrong in the Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time being remade, fully remade, reborn for a Nintendo Switch 2. Now, we do not understand just how significant of a remake this is going to be. We've seen Nintendo describe this as a full remake. They've used the word reborn many times in various ways throughout their mentions and promotion of this game so far, more so than other projects. And when you also take into consideration what we've seen from the teaser trailer and even what we've seen of Pence, I am led to believe that this is going to be a very significant remake here. We've talked about that already. But while we can agree that a lot of work is being done here, where there's still a lot of uncertainty is what they are going to get right. There are certain things I'm confident they are going to get right, but then there are other things where I have to take a step back and consider there are a few different directions they could take here, and depending on those directions they take and how they execute them, it could certainly leave some fans disappointed. There are some things to be concerned about here. And so today what I want to talk about is what Nintendo absolutely will not get wrong with this remake, and also talk about things Nintendo could potentially get wrong as well. And there's really a lot to be considered here, so we have a lot to discuss today. But before diving into things, let me remind you all I have this goal to reach 60,000 subscribers, hopefully really soon. I'm getting so close. So if you find yourself enjoying my videos and you haven't subscribed already, your subscription would make a big difference. So the first thing I'll say that Nintendo will not be getting wrong is the fact that they will be including voice acting. I think including voice acting here is such an obvious move that they need to make. It's been an expectation of mine for years already because we have been theorizing about this remake for such a long time. And I do 100% believe that there will be voice acting, and that's essentially confirmed at this point because the very initial teaser trailer we've gotten has a voice-acted narration there. To me, that's an extremely strong sign that this game will have voice acting. When we take a look at Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, those games already have voice acting. I think voice acting in modern 3D Zelda games should just be the expectation here. And so, yes, I don't think Nintendo's going to get this wrong. There will be voice acting. However, the execution of the voice acting is where maybe there is some room for concern. I've been bringing up Star Fox a lot lately in these Ocarina of Time remake discussions because I do think taking a look at the recent remake of Star Fox can at least give us a baseline understanding for what Nintendo will do for Ocarina of Time. I expect that in terms of effort and budget, the Ocarina of Time remake will be beyond Star Fox, but I still think it's worth comparing things to Star Fox here because that shows the bare minimum level of effort I think they'll put in. And I'm not trying to say Star Fox is a low effort thing, but I do think there's a difference in Nintendo putting in effort and resources into Star Fox versus Ocarina of Time, which is likely going to be Nintendo's biggest release for this year. And so looking at the voice acting for Star Fox, I actually think it's very good, for the most part. But there are a few scenes here and there, and I've seen other fans talk about this, where maybe it could have been done a little bit better. There are a few scenes where perhaps the original version on N64 hit a bit better. Actually, Star Fox back in the day had voice acting, and there were just some scenes that are a bit more dramatic. And so there is some level of concern I have that maybe not every scene in Ocarina of Time is going to hit really hard in the same way. Now, let me just say that overall, the voice acting in Star Fox is very good, and there's a lot of new stuff. They've added a whole bunch of new cutscenes, pretty much all of which I think are very good, and I think part of the issue with comparing in terms of what happens in the actual stages, in the actual missions, is that we have something to compare it to. The voice acting in Ocarina of Time is going to be entirely new, so there's not going to be a comparison point. We're not going to be looking for them to emulate exactly what happened back in the day. They're going to be kind of retelling the story with voice acting here. We've only had dialogue before, so in terms of the story being retold, in a lot of ways it's going to be reimagined here. So it's going to be something new, and I think that actually bodes well for us to look upon the voice acting more fondly. However, another thing to consider here, we take a look at Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. I think the voice acting for those games is actually pretty strong for the cutscenes. By the way, that's my expectation. Voice acting for the cutscenes, but not just like random gameplay moments where we're talking to a side character. All that small stuff will stage as small stuff. I mean like the big moments where we're talking to these bigger, more important characters here where there's going to be some cutscenes. Maybe Nintendo will be adding more cutscenes and such, but it's not going to be voice acted across the board. Look at Breath and Tears. That's kind of my expectation there in terms of the quantity and frequency in which we'll see the voice acting. But an issue that I think we see more prominently in specifically Breath of the Wild, less so in Tears of the Kingdom, is when we do have these cutscenes that take place between Link and other characters, because Link is basically mute, and so because of that, a lot of these dialogues are portrayed as monologues, which is unnatural. Now, what's interesting about Tears of the Kingdom, because a lot of the story takes place without Link in the past, all those characters talk, and so I actually feel like those scenes are told really well. Now, that's not going to really be the case in Ocarina of Time. Maybe they do have some stuff that tells story where Link is not really involved with the talking, and there is certainly some of that for sure. There's actually a few different pretty significant monologues that happen, but also something that I think actually bodes well is that similar to Donkey Kong Bonanza, Donkey Kong doesn't talk really that much either, but he had Pauline throughout the adventure, so she would kind of do a lot of the talking. Link is going to have Navi, so Navi can do a lot of the talking to make the dialogues during these cutscenes flow a lot better. So my main point here, with the voice acting, I would say we have minimal reason to be concerned. I think they're probably going to deliver here, and it's going to be pretty darn compelling. Now, something else I'm actually even more confident that Nintendo's going to execute really well here is the music. You look at what we saw with the teaser trailer. They knew exactly what they were doing with that. They knew people would remember the Kokiri theme, and the way it's been redone in an expert way. It's beautiful. And even just some of the other beats there, the way they're portraying this game, they're portraying it in a very grand, majestic, epic fashion. To me, the music we've heard from that brief teaser already tells me they know exactly what they're doing with this. They're going for something super grand and epic. This is Ocarina of Time, one of the greatest games ever made, and I think the intent here is to deliver a new score, a retold score, a redone score, with a lot of new elements that really delivers that level of experience. And it's not like this is Nintendo's first time putting in incredible music into a game. They've done it so many times. We've seen some pretty expert scores even recently, like in games like Metroid Prime 4, or even the reorchestrated tracks in Star Fox. It's incredible. But Nintendo always goes the extra level, goes a little bit more above and beyond. The very best efforts in terms of music come from Zelda. And so I have very little concerns in the musical department here. I think they're absolutely going to hit this part out of the park. Before continuing though, here's a brief message. I'm not really a jewelry or bling kind of guy, but I do like to look good, and I am a big fan of so many different games. So when King Ice, the sponsor for today's video, sent over these awesome necklaces, I had to take a look. As you see here with Sonic the Hedgehog and friends, there are hundreds of hand-set, brilliant cut stones. The level of detail here is just incredible, and it's beautiful. From all different angles, it's completely iced out. And all the gold, it's real 14K gold plating. And these are all officially licensed by Sega. There's even this nice Sega stamp on the back, so you know it's official. And then you have these custom boxes that they come in, with the Sonic logo in gold colored foil. There's a really nice premium and refined look to these boxes. These are collector's items with great attention to detail that's true to the character's look and feel, and they're only available at kingice.com. But King Ice is responsible for so many other different designs and collaborations. As you see here, I'm scrolling through, there are so many different companies involved. Yu-Gi-Oh!, Persona, and so much more. So make sure to check it all out with the link in the description below using my promo code, COLDESTRESTART. As confident as I am in the music though, I do have to say I have some concerns when it comes to the overall delivery, when it comes to mood and atmosphere. Now, from a musical perspective, I think they're going to do well in terms of that overall mood and atmosphere we're going to feel throughout the experience. But as we discussed in prior videos, we look at the changes we saw between the N64 version of Ocarina of Time versus the 3DS version, and it made things a lot more colorful and bright, which certainly I understand was a choice considering they were delivering this game on a much smaller screen. But I also think that there's a lot of opportunity to really deliver on a lot of the darker elements from the original N64 version with the new processing power of the Switch 2 and improvements in lighting and such. And I do actually think that there is optimism here, because you look at some of the visual effects we're seeing in the teaser trailer, and I'm not just talking about when we see Young Link, but even during the tapestry moments, because we can see kind of like this dark lighting. And so I do have an optimism that they can do these things, but I guess I'm just saying that I have somewhat of a concern, because we look at what they did with the 3DS version, and I do think things were impacted. Like, it's not just with lighting, but also how they handle blood and how gruesome some characters appear to be. Like, we look at the bottom of the well, and there were certainly things that were dialed down a bit. I hope that they don't do that in this version of Ocarina of Time. Now, I'll also say, we look at some of the redesigns, specifically with Link, and they're clearly going in a more realistic direction, so that actually gives me a little bit more room for optimism as well, that they are going to deliver in terms of delivering a certain level of realism here, which I think will also mean that when we see some of these other designs, these other environments, they will take that into consideration as well. So it's not a big concern of mine. I think overall they're going to deliver here, but it's certainly something to look at. Something else that factors into the overall feeling and atmosphere of the game, though, is how the story is told. Now, I've mentioned the voice acting, and that's certainly going to be important in terms of the overall execution of the story, but I'm talking about, like, the story elements here. Are they going to deepen the overall story experience? Are they going to expand on it? Are they going to just deliver it one-to-one? And so, depending on what direction they go with this, I think they could potentially miss. Now, my belief is that they will not be missing here, in the sense that they're going to do a one-to-one story recreation here. Like, if it's totally one-to-one, I think that would actually be a huge miss, and I do not believe that is what is going to happen. I'm confident that they're going to do a bit better than that. And so, let me kind of explain what I'm getting at here. We take a look at Skyward Sword. Skyward Sword is the first Zelda game in the timeline of things. And in that game, they really go over the story of the goddess. And so there are the goddess statues that we see originating from Skyward Sword, but they also are in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. The goddess statue is now a symbol we see throughout the world of Hyrule, showing that long history of worshiping the goddess from its very origins before Hyrule was even founded. And so what's interesting about this, though, is that we go back to games before Skyward Sword, there are no goddess statues, but Nintendo created new lore where the goddess is worshipped, and so other Zelda games are kind of lacking those details because it wasn't created until later on, right? It's kind of like a retcon. They're changing the continuity here to where there has been this goddess that was worshipped from the very beginning. And so, with this recreation of Ocarina of Time, I think it's important to recontextualize things here with new lore in mind, including goddess statues. There need to be goddess statues throughout, and I do believe that they are going to do that. I do think that they are going to change some elements, so Ocarina of Time, this new version, is fitting within the new lore of Zelda, of modern Zelda, with Skyward Sword in mind, Breath of the Wild in mind, and Tears of the Kingdom in mind. And so that also has me thinking about, for example, King Rauru, the first king of Hyrule, introduced in Tears of the Kingdom. With this in mind now, it now offers more context for the Sage of Rauru, the Sage of Light, in Ocarina of Time. Will there be some sort of mention or reference to that? There's a lot of opportunities here, from this perspective, to deepen the lore, and that is my expectation, but they could possibly miss if they don't do these things. But then another consideration here. Deepening the lore, I think, is something they need to do, but something they might also do, and this is where they could potentially really veer off and create some issues for some fans, or even a lot of fans, is if they don't just deepen the lore and story of Ocarina of Time, but expand on it. And while I do want them to expand on it to an extent, I think once you start to do that, you run the risk of changing the story too much. Will this still be Ocarina of Time? And if they expand things too much, they change around things too much, then some people may question if this is even a proper delivery of the legend of Ocarina of Time. Something that I think they should do is I think they should include something, and maybe it's subtle. I'm not saying for something drastic, and I know there's been debates about this, but we understand that Ocarina of Time creates a huge timeline split, a triple split here where it goes off into 3 different directions after Ocarina of Time. I do think there should be something in the game that is suggestive to that. And again, it can be subtle, but it's not really apparent at all in the original or 3DS version of Ocarina of Time, because they're the same thing and they didn't change the story. So something like that I think would be good, but they also could go too far here and make this into something else. Like, what if they decide to just give us one ending here where Link dies at the end? Some people might really love that, but then Ocarina of Time doesn't end in the same way. So I'm not saying that's what they're going to do, but it's a potential point they could miss. Ultimately, though, I think what they're going to do is simply deepen the story, fill in a little bit more details, have little things like adding goddess statues, a little bit of context for Raru's name considering the first king of Hyrule. Things like that I think will help to enrich the experience, and most Zelda fans will definitely be appreciating it. Now, something that I've been hoping for and talking about for them to improve is the combat. I think combat in Zelda has actually been aging quite a bit. There's a lot of third-person action-adventure games nowadays, and I feel the combat systems in these games are pretty awesome. They're pretty fun, and Zelda, by comparison, at least when it comes to the swordplay and such, is a little bit lacking. And so I think we have an opportunity here for Nintendo to go back to Ocarina of Time and perhaps modernize this. And my fear is that they won't really do that much. My fear is what they'll do is simply take Ocarina of Time, maybe take the 3DS version in terms of controls, and just map that to Switch 2 controls with dual analog control. That would be kind of like the bare minimum. And the bare minimum would be playable, but would that really be considered good? I think that would be a missed opportunity there. So in my opinion, that would be a mistake, and it is a little bit of a concern of mine if they are that minimal with this. However, I also understand that if we're talking about modernizing the combat here, we're then talking about them being more ambitious with this remake and making some more substantial changes. How far do you go? Because if you go too far, then that could also potentially lead to some problems here. I think what a lot of you may be realizing as I continue throughout this discussion is that it's about striking the right balance between maintaining the essence and spirit of Ocarina of Time, still making sure you're retelling this story, this legend, but also delivering enough new to where this feels like a significant experience, making it a worthwhile retelling here. In my opinion, I think Nintendo has missed the boat quite a few times when they were visiting prior Zeldas, because they failed to add new content, significant new content. But we also consider today's modern standards. You look at things like the Resident Evil remakes, or the Final Fantasy VII or Remake trilogy, or even some of Nintendo's own offerings, like with the Xenoblade series, for example, where they do add significant new content. I think looking at today's standards now and considering what Nintendo is trying to deliver here, there is more reason to deliver new. That is kind of more of the expectation today. And so I have more optimism that they'll do this, but again, how much will they do, and will they do it in the right way? That matters, and it's not an easy balance to strike. But when considering combat here, if they were to be modernizing things, I think that would also mean you would have to think about the enemies as well, how enemies will be redesigned, if there will be new enemies, and enemy placements, and the AI for these enemies, and how hard they are to deal with. There's a lot of room there to make things more interesting. And that also extends to boss fights, and I think with boss fights, they should be redesigning them. They should be redesigning them in a way where they feel more grand to help to deliver this epic experience here. And will they be pushovers, or will they actually be challenging? Which brings me to another point, and this is something where Zelda has kind of gone up and down in different directions over the years, and that's just overall difficulty. I personally feel that Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom have fixed a lot of difficulty issues I've had with the Zelda series over the years. I would say that those games are challenging, however, they've been designed in a way where, depending on how you play them, they can be more challenging than not, and I think that's great so it appeals to a larger audience. But what can they do about Ocarina of Time? Because Ocarina of Time isn't Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom, and while I do think they're going to be adding some new elements, are they going to be entirely redesigning the game where it can be played in various ways like Breath and Tears? That I'm not so sure on. I think it would be nice if they just added like a hero mode, so for those who are not looking for as much of a challenge, you don't have to pick the hero mode, and for those who want that challenge, you have the hero mode here, and I hope that this hero mode is balanced in a way where it's not just like the enemies just hit you once and you die. It would be great if they actually made the hero mode more interesting, where there's actually like some AI differences here, or at least something about the experience that makes it more interesting. We do know in prior hero modes for Zelda games, they just make hearts extremely sparse, and it adds more of a need to take advantage of potions and such, and a little bit more planning there, and that certainly can make a difference. But I also think that they actually need to take a look at how enemies are, how bosses are. That matters too, because if you can play the game in a way where you're never going to get hit if they are that easy, then it doesn't really matter if you have potions or not. But difficulty here goes beyond just how you fight, but also the puzzle solving. And this is something that I think is going to be really interesting to look at here, because how Nintendo's been handling dungeons over the different Zelda generations has been a recurring talking point. I think the dungeons in Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask were incredible. And over the years, in some ways, I think dungeons have seen a lot of improvements when we look at the Wind Waker and Twilight Princess and Skyward Sword, but also the dungeons, especially in Skyward Sword, became more like experiences and perhaps were a little bit easier. And then you look at Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, dungeons, I would say, have then become less elaborate, less interesting. I do think they've started to make a little bit of a comeback in Tears of the Kingdom. I think we saw improvements, and then with Echoes of Wisdom, they started incorporating some of the older classic dungeon elements and kind of blending them into the newer style of Zelda, which is really cool. And so it's going to be very interesting to see how they handle dungeons in this remake. Are they just going to be one-to-one copies? Or are they going to redesign them? And if they redesign them, how exactly are they going to redesign them? I personally think it would be a mistake to just do one-to-one dungeons here. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I think overall, there are going to be significant redesigns here. We've already seen that with the teaser trailer, actually. But with these redesigns, I think that also comes the expectation that the scale of the game is going to change. And if we're going to be changing the scale of the game, that means that the environments are going to literally change in structure. Like, I think we can even see a little bit of that when taking a look at Link's room. It is not structurally the same in terms of scale and ratios to what we saw in the N64 or 3DS versions. There's a lot different there. And so I do think that comes with an implication that just overall, this version of Hyrule is going to be designed differently. And I also think that means the dungeons themselves are going to feel at least a little bit different, which I think is a good thing. I think if they just recreate the dungeons one-to-one exactly and just gave them a fresh coat of paint, a really nice fresh coat of paint, kind of like what they did with Star Fox, I don't think that would be quite enough. I don't think it would work perfectly well. And personally, I will be underwhelmed if it's the same dungeons. I've played these dungeons so many different times. There have been different versions of Ocarina of Time that have come out over the years. I think it would be more interesting if they were to redesign the dungeons to carry the same spirit and essence of the original versions, but also remix them so they feel like new experiences at the same time. Of course, when they do that, I'm sure a lot of people are going to be wondering, would these redesigns still feel like expertly crafted dungeons that made a lot of fans fall in love with the Zelda series back during the 90s and the early 2000s, or are they going to feel more simplified the way they do in Breath and Tears? I've been arguing that Nintendo was putting so much more of an emphasis on the open world and the physics and such, that's why the dungeons feel the way they do in Breath and Tears, but now that they've gone that direction, as we've seen the progression from Breath to Tears and Echoes of Wisdom, they will start to incorporate a lot of those classic dungeon elements as well and create a new hybrid. Could we see a little bit of that direction with dungeon redesigns in Ocarina of Time? It's going to be interesting to see. Now, I guess you could say that if they were to be redesigning the dungeons here, then that's already a form of dramatic new content. And I just want to stress that I'm not saying like the dungeons need to be entirely redone here, but it would be interesting if they were to mix things up at least a little bit. But then something else I'm sure a lot of fans are considering, myself included, is what kind of new content could we see in this game? Could we see some new dungeons? Could we see them go back to ideas with cut content like an ice temple or a light temple, for example? Will they make the medallions give us abilities? Considering modern Zelda like Breath, Tears, and Echoes of Wisdom, where there are so many different cosmetic choices and such, and considering how there was already some of that in Ocarina of Time, would they be expanding upon that more significantly? And how will they be handling items this time around? If they're going to update the mechanics somewhat, will they rethink how they handle the hookshot, for example? And could there be other new items as well? Will they fill up the overworld with side quests and such? Could there even be new story elements added on top of that? There's all these other little things they could potentially include, and I think this kind of brings me back to what I've been saying throughout this video, that there is a balance to strike here between retaining the original feel and vision of Ocarina of Time while also incorporating something new, making this a modern experience, a proper retelling of this legendary adventure. I personally do not want to see just a one-to-one remake for Ocarina of Time. I think there's a lot of issues with that. Ocarina of Time, as it is, has not aged well. I think Nintendo literally does have to go back and redesign a lot of this game for it to feel like a proper modern game. And when I say a proper modern game, I'm not saying Breath of the Wild-ify Ocarina of Time. This still needs to be Ocarina of Time, but it needs to be Ocarina of Time as if it were made for today's standards. And so in my mind, what that means is grander boss fights, better combat, a better realized world with a grander scale. But by being this ambitious, there is that balance to strike between retaining that original spirit and introducing a little bit of that new. That's what I think. But what do you think? Where do you fall here? Do you want this to be more one-to-one? Do you want them to introduce new? And what concerns might you have about what they may introduce that could be new? Let me know in the comments below. This is AndresRestart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I will see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.